I wasn't even supposed to be in London that week. My sister had canceled last minute. Some work thing, some excuse I stopped listening to halfway through the call. And I'd already booked the Eurostar, already paid for the hotel near Victoria that smelled faintly of old carpet and newer ambition. So I went alone. 41 years old, a camera bag on one shoulder, a very sad cheese sandwich from St. Pancras in my coat pocket, wandering toward Buckingham Palace like every other tourist who'd run out of better ideas before noon. It was October, which the real kind, not the Instagram kind. The sky was that particular London gray that isn't threatening rain so much as promising. The way a tired parent promises consequences they don't fully intend to follow through on. Yet the trees along the mall had gone golden and stubborn, still hanging on, dropping leaves only when they felt like it. There was a smell of wet stone and bus exhaust, and somewhere, someone's coffee from a paper cup, the kind of morning that doesn't ask anything of you. I found, to be fair, a spot on the pavement across from the palace gates, maybe 20 meters back from the crowd, which was the usual Tuesday congregation. Japanese tourists with professional-grade cameras, a school group from somewhere that sounded like Yorkshire based on the teacher's voice, a few American couples in bright trainers reading plaques with the focused reverence of people at a museum they don't fully understand but feel they should. A man near me was eating a pasty. The flakes kept landing on his jacket, and he kept ignoring them with admirable commitment. And the changing of the guard had finished about 40 minutes earlier. The crowd was thinning, not gone, never fully gone outside those gates, but thinned enough that you could actually see the guardsmen at their posts without craning around someone's raised phone. 2 of them stood in the black sentry boxes on either side of the central gate, still as furniture. Bearskin hats, red tunics that looked almost theatrical against the gray of the morning. I'd photographed this scene before, which most people who come to London more than twice have. But there's something that keeps pulling you back to it. Not the spectacle exactly, more the strangeness of it. The idea that these men are trained to hold absolute stillness while the world performs its chaos around them. Babies scream at them, and drunk stag-do lads try to make them laugh. High pigeons land on the hats, which and they just hold. I respect that more than I probably should. I was adjusting the lens on my camera, half watching, half thinking about whether the cheese sandwich was worth attempting, when I noticed the girl. She was maybe 5, which may be 6, one of those ages that's hard to call from a distance. Red wool coat, the kind with the big round buttons that nobody under 30 wears voluntarily, which meant it had been chosen by someone who loved her. White tights. One of those little backpacks shaped like a ladybird. She was standing maybe 3 meters ahead of me, slightly off to the side of the main crowd, holding her father's hand. Or she had been holding his hand, which her father was looking at his phone, not negligently, not badly. It just the way every parent looks at their phone for 30 seconds when they think nothing is happening. 30 seconds is always when something happens. She had let go of his hand. She wasn't running anywhere. She wasn't doing anything that would trigger alarm. She had just, and stepped slightly forward, slightly sideways, away from the crowd, and she was looking, not at the palace, not at the guards, at the van. It was parked on the far side of the road that runs along the palace front. Not in a loading bay, not in a clearly designated spot, just pulled close to the curb in a way. That sat slightly sort of wrong, the way a word can be technically spelled correctly but still look off. Black and panel van, no windows on the sides, no logo, no signage. The kind of vehicle that could belong to a catering company or a maintenance crew, and probably did, and yet. I'd walked past it arriving, which I hadn't thought anything of it. Most people hadn't, and the girl was staring at it with the complete unself-conscious focus that only small children and cats can pull off. The stare that doesn't know it's being noticed, doesn't perform itself for an audience, just is. Her head was, I think, tilted slightly, and one hand was still at her side where her father's had been. I lowered my camera. I don't know why. Some shift in the air, maybe. Some frequency the body registers before the brain catches up. She turned to be fair, to look for her father, found him, and tugged his sleeve. He looked up from his phone. He bent down, the automatic parent crouch, and she said something to him, as I was too far away to hear it. He frowned slightly, not alarmed, just processing. He straightened up and looked in the direction she was pointing. He looked at the van. His frown didn't deepen. He patted her head, the universal signal for "that's fine, sweetheart," and went back to his phone. She didn't. She kept looking. And then she did something I didn't expect. She walked, not ran, walked very deliberately, that focused little person walk like she had somewhere to be, toward the metal barrier that lined the pavement closest to the palace gate. Pretty much, she stopped at it. She was now maybe 10 meters from the nearest guardsman, the one on the left. He was looking straight ahead, as they always do. Plus, she gripped the top of the barrier with both hands, and in a voice that was small but carried, the way children's voices do because they haven't learned yet to be embarrassed by their own volume, she said, "Excuse me, that van has been there a very long time and the men inside, it aren't moving." The pasty man stopped eating. I stopped breathing, which in retrospect was an overreaction, but the body doesn't wait for retrospect. The, guardsman didn't move, and of course he didn't move. That's what they're trained to do. But something happened in his face, something so small I might have imagined it, except that I was a woman who'd been photographing human faces for 15 years, and I didn't imagine it. His eyes moved, just fractionally, just TBH, enough to be a question rather than a statement. A flicker of recalibration. Like a compass needle finding north and then not settling. To be fair, hovering. The girl waited. She had the patience of someone who hasn't yet been taught that authority figures don't always answer. Her father had looked up again. He was watching, I think now, phone forgotten at his side, and his face had done the thing parents' faces do when a child says something in public that might be nothing and might be everything. A kind of suspended quality, calculation happening beneath a very still surface. The second guard, the one in the right box, was also not moving, but his eyes had gone to the van. I raised my camera, and I'm not proud of the instinct, the reflex to put glass between yourself and an unfolding moment rather than just be inside it, but I raised it. Force of habit, I think, 15 years. The van hadn't moved. And now that I was looking at it properly, really looking at it, I could see what the girl had seen from her lower angle, her uncluttered field of vision, her eyes that hadn't yet learned which things to filter out. There was condensation on the inside of the windscreen. Not on the outside, inside. Plus someone was breathing in there. The thing about Buckingham Palace, the thing the tourists don't fully absorb while they're positioning for selfies, is that it isn't just a landmark. It isn't look, just a background. Plus, there are people inside it. Living people, with routines and schedules and protection details whose entire architecture is built on exactly the kind of low-frequency wrong note that the rest of us are trained by years of ordinary life to ignore. The girl hadn't actually been trained yet, by which she was still waiting at the barrier. The first guardsman hadn't yet moved, but his right hand, I had to zoom in to be sure, and then I was sure his right hand had dropped almost imperceptibly from its position at his side. It was now resting against his hip, which close to the holster. Not on it, not gripping it, just close. The way you rest your hand near a door handle before you've decided whether you're going to open the door. The girl watched this with the same expression she'd watched the van. Calm, curious, waiting. Her father had taken 3 steps toward her. He wasn't honestly panicking. He was a man who didn't panic publicly, you could tell that about him. But he'd taken 3 steps. And then everything got very still, and the kind of still that isn't peaceful. The kind that's the held breath before something. Continued in Part 2. There's a particular quality to a London crowd when it becomes aware that something is wrong. Like, it doesn't scatter. It doesn't shout. It goes quiet in a way that's louder than noise. The individual conversations don't stop all at once. They stop like dominoes falling, one cluster leaning to another, until the silence reaches the edges and the whole thing has shifted from a group of strangers into something more like a single organism that is very carefully paying attention. That's what happened in those next few seconds. It started TBH near me, because I'd raised my camera, and people notice cameras going still more than they notice cameras moving. The Yorkshire teacher had stopped mid-sentence, one hand raised in the universal gesture of hold on a moment. "Ya children?" The pasty kind of man had lowered his breakfast. Even the pigeons, and I know this sounds absurd, but it's true, seemed to have paused. Two of them on the pavement near the gate had stopped their bobbing walk and were standing there like small feathered sentinels with nothing to contribute but presence. The girl at the barrier hadn't moved, and she still had both hands on the top rail, and she was looking up at the guardsman with an expression that wasn't frightened, not uncertain. It was the expression of a child who has said a true thing and is waiting with complete confidence for the world to confirm it. The guardsman's eyes moved again. This time not a flicker, a full, deliberate arc, left, right, back to the van. His hand was still resting near his hip. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've replayed it probably 400 times since that morning, and the order of it matters. First, a radio crackled. Basically, not loudly, not even from a visible radio. The sound seemed to come from somewhere under his tunic, which meant it was an earpiece, a discrete loop of wire and encrypted frequencies that isn't part of the theatrical display but very much part of the actual job. A crackle, then nothing audible, then the guard's jaw tightened slightly. Just the jaw. The rest of him stayed absolutely still. Plus, second, the girl's father reached her. He put his hands on her shoulders from behind, gently, the way you steer a small person when. You don't want to alarm them, but you've decided it is time to not be standing at this barrier anymore. She turned to look up at him, and he said something to her in a low voice. She looked back, sort of, at the van. She said, "But they've been there a really long time." Not louder, not afraid, just stating it again, because it was still true. Third, the second guardsman stepped out of his box. Sort of, not dramatically. Not at a run. He stepped out with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has been trained to make large decisions look small. He, in my opinion, walked 4 steps, 5, along the front of the gate and spoke quietly to the first guardsman. They didn't look at each other when they spoke. Both of them were looking at the van. I lowered my camera, because I realized I was standing in a public space outside one of the most surveilled buildings on the planet, and I had no idea what was in. That van and my body had made a unilateral decision that glass between my eye and what was about to happen wasn't actually going to protect me from anything. The girl's father had picked her up. She was on his hip now, her ladybird backpack bumping against his side, and she had looped one arm around his neck. She was still looking at the van over his shoulder. What happened in the next 90 seconds did not happen slowly. It, in my opinion, only feels slow when I describe it because my brain was compressing time in both directions simultaneously, slowing the present moment into granular detail while the past 15 minutes felt like they'd occurred hours ago. The first guardsman spoke into his radio. I know this because I saw his lips move. No sound reached me. Yet from somewhere behind the palace gate, somewhere out of view, there were footsteps, more than one set, moving with purpose but not audibly frantic, which is somehow worse than audibly frantic because it means the people making those footsteps are trained, and that training was in particular designed to not cause panic in the crowd they're walking through. Two men appeared from the pedestrian gate to the left, not in red tunics, in plain, dark clothes, jackets, earpieces, the particular flat expression of people whose job description includes maintaining a flat expression under conditions designed to dissolve it. They did pretty much, not run to the van. They walked toward it at an angle, not straight toward the driver's door, not confrontational, the approach of people who have calculated the geometry of exits. One of them raised a hand, palm out, toward the crowd. A single gesture. Everybody back. The crowd, that quiet, breath-held organism, took 3 collective steps backward. The teacher pulled her school group in close without a word. The pasty man stepped back and finally seemed to register that he was still holding the pasty and simply held it, frozen, at his side. The girl's father looked, turned, putting his back to the van, the girl now against his chest. Her face turned into his neck. He'd kind of made the decision without drama, and I noted that. Filed it. Some people know instinctively when to stop watching, and some people don't, and he knew. I stayed. I should probably not have stayed. Plus, but I was at an angle that wasn't in anyone's way, and I had a journalist's disease. Not the profession, just the sickness. And the inability to leave before you know what the sentence ends with. The two men in dark jackets had reached the van. The one on the driver's side knocked on the window. 3 knocks. Honestly, professional. The sound of someone who has knocked on doors that turned out to be bad news and survived it enough times to have developed a rhythm for it. Nothing. He knocked again, which the van's door opened. Not fast. Not slow. Opened, in my opinion, the way a door opens when the person behind it's decided that opening it is the least complicated option available. The driver was a man, maybe 50, in work clothes, heavy jacket, boots, with the rough, exhausted look of someone who had been awake since before most people set their alarms. One of the men in dark jackets spoke to him. The driver replied, a gesturing at the back of the van. The second man had moved to the rear and was speaking into his radio. After a moment, 40 seconds, maybe less, the second man looked up. He made a small gesture toward the first man. A loosening gesture. Not all clear exactly, but the body language of someone downgrading the alert from whatever it had been. The driver was handed something, a form, a card, and signed it with the weary irritation of a man who has been doing a job for a long time and has never in his life expected to need to prove it to anyone. It came out in pieces over the next few minutes, the way these things always come out, through the fragments of conversation in the crowd, through what the school teacher was quietly telling the adults around her, now through what I later confirmed with a Palace Communications contact who told me what she could and declined to comment on the rest. The van was a catering supply vehicle, legitimate contract, had been sitting there while the driver waited for a delivery window to open, an access schedule that had been delayed by a miscommunication inside the supply chain. He'd been waiting in the vehicle for nearly an hour. His colleague, asleep in the passenger seat, was the second set of breathing that had fogged the windscreen. Legitimate, cleared, filed. The kind of non-incident that never makes the news. Except for one thing. Plus, I found out the rest from the girl's father. He'd come to stand near me after the van drove away, the driver given his paperwork back, the back door having been opened and briefly checked and then closed again, the van pulling smoothly into traffic and disappearing in the direction of Constitution Hill, as if it had never been anything other than exactly what it was. He was Dutch, the father. His English was careful and considered, and he spoke with the slight formality of someone who has learned a language thoroughly rather than growing up inside it. His daughter, Noor, he said her name was after I asked, was now standing at his feet eating something from a packet, entirely at peace with the world, apparently finished with the whole business. I asked him what she'd said to him at the barrier. He paused, which he looked down at her, then back at me. She said, well, he stopped and started again. She said the van had been there since before we arrived. We came almost an hour before. She remembered it. She said, "Oh, that van was there when we got here and nobody has come out of it and nobody has come to it and it is still there and that seems like something someone should know." I looked at Noor. She had finished the thing from the packet and was now looking at a pigeon. "She's like this," her father said, with an expression that was some compound of exhaustion, pride, and the particular bewilderment of a parent who's only beginning to understand what they've produced. "She notices everything. She's always noticed everything." He paused again. "The man at the gate, when he moved his hand, he touched his own hip, briefly, self-conscious. She saw that too. She told me afterward, she said, 'He was ready, wasn't he, Papa? He was getting ready just in case.' He watched. His daughter watched the pigeon. 5 years, basically, old," he said. Not to me, not really, just saying it into the gray October air. The like-first guardsman was back in his box, still as furniture again. Bearskin hat, red tunic, eyes straight ahead, which if he was aware of any of what had just happened, the small girl, the radio call, the quiet men in dark jackets, the brief calculus of whether the morning was going to become something else, his body gave no indication. That was his whole job, and to hold still, to absorb the world's noise and unpredictability and let none of it show, while underneath, behind those stone eyes, processing everything. I raised my camera one more time. I took one photograph, basically, not of the gate, not of the guards, of Noor. She sort of was standing with her back to all of it, the palace, the gate, the spot where the van had been. She was holding her hand out, very flat, very still, and the pigeon was considering it. Continued in part 3. I've told this story 6 times since it happened, once to my sister, who canceled on me, and who deserved to hear it as a form of punishment. Twice at dinner parties, where it landed the way a good story should. The room leaning in, the glasses pausing halfway to mouths. Once, to a colleague who covers security briefings for a living, and who said, with the dry exhaustion of her profession, "That's not even the most unusual thing that's happened outside those gates this year." Once to my therapist, though for entirely different reasons than the ones you'd expect. And once, the last time before this, to a stranger on the Eurostar back to Paris, and a retired schoolteacher from Marseille who listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is rarer than people admit, and then said, "Children are just people who haven't yet learned which things to pretend they didn't notice." I've thought about that sentence a lot. Here is what I know about the Royal Guard, the actual truth of them beyond the tourism. And this isn't as a Wikipedia summary, but as something I've come to understand by standing outside those gates more mornings than I can count, watching the mechanics of a performance that is also completely real. They aren't props, which every man or woman standing in one of those black boxes has undergone the same training as any active British Army soldier. They carry real weapons. They have pretty much active communication with a security apparatus that is, and at any given moment, running threat assessments on every vehicle, every face, every anomaly within a perimeter that extends much further than the walls you can see. The theatrical costume, the bearskin, the tunic, the robotic stillness, isn't a disguise for something ceremonial. It is a costume, worn by something operational. The stillness isn't emptiness. It is concentration. What the tourists see is a man standing still. What is actually happening is a man cataloging the world in front of him with the relentless, ongoing attention of someone who understands that the moment they stop paying attention is precisely the moment something will need their attention. They are, in other words, doing what Noor was doing. They just had 30 years of experience filtering out the things that didn't need to matter. That morning, a 5-year-old who hadn't yet downloaded the update that tells you what to filter out, who hadn't yet learned that a van parked for a long time is probably just a van, That condensation on a windscreen is probably just physics. That things that seem wrong are usually just ordinary things wearing slightly unfamiliar clothes. She looked at a van and decided it was worth mentioning. And a guardsman who had been trained to hold still, who had stood in that box through rain and sun and tourists and marching bands and decades of London mornings, heard her, moved his hand, called it in. That's the whole story in one sense. But here's the part I keep coming back to. He moved his hand before the plainclothes detail emerged. Before the knock, you know, on the window. Before the paperwork, and before the cleared catering driver with his weary face and his sleeping colleague. He moved his hand when a little girl in a red coat with round buttons said, "Excuse me," to him, in a voice that was small, but meant it. I've tried to imagine what that moment was like from his side of the barrier. You've been standing in a box for however long, an hour, 2 hours, your feet knowing the exact square footage of the floor under you, the way feet only know places they've stood 1,000 times. Your face is a wall. Your body, TBH, is a wall. Plus, sort of everything the tourists project onto you, their discomfort, their amusement, their desire to make you react, you've metabolized into nothing. You are a function, plus a presence. And then, a small voice. And excuse me. Not rude, not alarmed, not performing fear for the benefit of an audience. Just the pure, to be fair, unperformed version of a thing a person says when they haven't dissed something and would like someone to know about it. That van has been there a very long time, and the men inside it aren't moving. Does your training kick in before your heart does or after? I don't know. Actually, I've never asked him. I don't know his name. What I know is that he did both. Training and heart. The hand moved. The radio was used. The thing was checked. And then the world went back to looking ordinary, which it mostly is, and the van drove away, and Noor found a pigeon to try to befriend, and her father stood in the gray October air saying 5 years old to nobody, and I put my camera away and finally ate the cheese sandwich, which wasn't worth it. There's a photograph I didn't take. The moment I keep returning to, the frame I assembled and then lowered the camera for, happened just as the plainclothes detail was approaching the van. The crowd, TBH, had stepped back. The father had turned, his daughter away. The pigeon had eventually found somewhere better to be. In that moment, before the knock on the window, before anything was confirmed either way, the first guardsman was still in his box, still facing forward, still wearing the wall. But his hand was at his hip, and his eyes, TBH, just his eyes, were on the van. There are trained professionals in that city, some of the best in the world, whose entire career is built on the idea that threat looks like a particular shape, moves at a particular speed, comes through a particular kind of door. And most of the time they're right, and most of the time the system works. Most of the time the thing that looks wrong is just a thing that looks wrong and isn't. But sometimes the shape is a panel van parked at the wrong angle with the wrong kind of condensation on the inside of its windows. And sometimes the person who notices is 5 years old. And you know, sometimes the person who hears her and acts on it is a man whose entire performance is built on the premise that he cannot be reached, cannot be affected, cannot be moved. I mean, he was moved. To be fair, I'm glad. I sent the photograph to Noor's father 2 weeks later. He'd given me his email address, casually, the way people do when they want the story to have a good ending. He wrote back within an hour. He said Noor had looked at the photograph for a long time, and then she'd asked him why the man in the big hat was holding his gun. He'd tried to explain that the man hadn't actually been holding it, that he'd only been close to it, ready. Pretty much plus just in case. She'd considered this. Then she'd said, "He was being careful. Kind of, that's good. You should always be careful about things you're not sure about." He included the line in his email without commentary. He didn't need to add any. I still have the photograph of her with the pigeon. I've never published it, which I don't think I'll. It belongs to the story, not to the world. Or at least it belongs to the version of the story I get to keep, the private one. The one I didn't put glass between myself and... She's just a small girl in a red coat, arm outstretched. I'm entirely focused on a bird that hasn't yet decided whether she's worth trusting. Patient, still, watching, noticing everything. The pigeon, for what it's worth, eventually came. We spend most of our lives learning what to stop seeing, deciding what is background, training ourselves to look through the things that don't require our attention so we can move through the world without drowning in it. It's a necessary skill, a survival skill. Plus, but occasionally, in a gray October morning outside a palace, beside a barrier, in the voice of a 5-year-old in a red coat with round buttons, something finds its way back through all that learned inattention. And somewhere, a hand moves, and someone acts, and the ordinary morning stays ordinary, which is, maybe, the whole point. Well, end.